Hello everyone, and welcome to day 4 of our bootcamp. Our app by this stage is actually almost complete. All we need to do is implement the database functions themselves and then implement throughout the code where we want to execute those functions. For example, if we're adding a new item in add item activity, then of course we want to add it to the database. Whereas when we're deleting or editing an item, we want to edit or delete it in that corresponding place. And then also in our main activity where we're displaying all the items in a list format, we'll want to fetch our items. So we know there's going to be 4 main pieces of functionality that we'll need to implement, and all of the functions themselves will be implemented in database operations. So my goal for this section is just to implement all of the functions in database operations, and then we can work for the rest of the day to actually find the places in the code where we need to execute them and write the code to do so. Now, I haven't added anything to where we finished off yesterday. If you try to implement your own versions of these functions, or at the very least write the skeletons of them, then kudos to you. If you didn't, then don't worry about it. I know it's pretty difficult if you've never used the Android's SQLite database before. But what I'd like to do is run through 1 or 2 of the functions with you guys, explain a little bit about how we might implement the other 2, and then have you try them yourselves. Of course, we will provide the solutions at the end, but it's best that you do give them a go at least, and then look at the solution rather than the other way around. Okay, so for starters, we should probably implement these 2 functions, our onCreate and onUpgrade. So these are actually going to be, these are going to be quite simple to implement. I just want to first of all get rid of those question marks. I don't want these to be nullables. I'd rather have them be non-nullable variables. So our onCreate is called basically the first time that a database is opened or created. It's not called when our database operations instance is created. This is going to be called when either we upgrade a database, so we need to clear all the data and start all over again, or it's the first time we're using it. So in our case, we're actually just going to execute this SQL query, create tables, which is going to basically set up our database for us to use. So we'll call upon our DB here, our SQLite database. We want to execute a SQL statement, or exec SQL, and we're just going to pass in database info dot SQL create table query. So this is just going to create a table for us, set it up. That's actually all we need to do. And we're going to do a fairly similar thing in onUpgrade, but instead of just creating the table, we actually want to delete or drop the old table because we want to get rid of the old info and start a new table. So we're going to call upon our DB, we're going to execute a SQL statement. That is just going to be, again, our database info. And this time we want to call upon our delete table query. If you remember, this is just dropping the table if it exists, and then we want to create a new database. So then we're going to call on create, and we're going to pass in that DB parameter here. Okay, we'll leave on downgrade alone. Actually, no, this says super on downgrade. We actually want super on upgrade. So upgrade. Or rather than super on upgrade, we'll actually just have our on upgrade. Okay, that should be just a call to here. I think I spelt it wrong, and yeah, I did. Okay, good stuff. So now we can work on the 4 main functions that we'll want. If you want to add additional functions, that's totally fine as well, or modify the ones that we'll implement, but I'll show you the 4 main ones that I usually end up using. Sometimes I add more as well. These are again going to be our add, modify, or update. We'll have a delete, and of course our fetch items. Actually, fetch should probably come right after add. So these are our 4 main pieces of functionality. Often when we're fetching items, we'll want to fetch just one item at a time, which we can call upon by name, or we can fetch all of the items, in which case we're just fetching everything that we find in the table or in the database. Similarly with add, usually we'll want to add only one item at a time, but we could add multiple. We could modify the function to do so. Modifying or update, same thing. We usually only want to add or modify or update one item at a time, and same with delete. Otherwise, we might as well just drop the whole table. So I think I'll walk you through these first 2 functions, and then I'll let you try these 2 for yourself. I'll show you which functions on our database, or which functions are existing within our SQLite Open Helper that you'll need to update or delete, but then I'll let you try them out yourself. Okay, so first our add function. Let's just call this one add item. Okay, it's going to need to take in some parameters. The first will be a database operations instance. Now this might seem a little unintuitive, but we are going to need this. I'm going to call this DBO for short, which is going to be an instance of database operations. Okay, so that's actually the class we're working in. So again, it might seem a little weird, but we do need this. We're going to then pass in an item name, which is going to be of type string. We're going to pass in our case, an item date. So item date of type string. And then we can pass in whether or not it's urgent. But what we could do to make this even easier on ourselves and pass in fewer parameters is actually just pass in an actual to-do item. And that way we can get all of these fields and don't have to separate them and then pass them in separately. So let's actually just shorten this to passing in a to-do item of type to-do item. Okay, that way we can get again all the fields we want, but we'll have to be careful to make sure that all three of those fields are populated. And by the three fields I mean the name, date, and whether or not it's urgent. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is get an instance of what's called a writable database. So for our add and modify and delete, we're actually writing to the database. We're inserting items, we're modifying items, or we're deleting items. So we'll need to get what's called a DBO dot get writable database. Okay, this is different from the DBO.readable database, and we'll use just the readable one when we want to fetch an item because we're actually not modifying anything. So let's store this in a val. I'm just going to call this DB. It's going to be equal to DBO.writable database. Okay. So here's where we can get the item name, urgency, and the date. I'm just going to say val item name is going to be equal to do item dot name. Okay. I'm going to do the same for our urgency and date. So is item urgent is equal to do item dot is urgent. And then I'm just going to say val item date is going to be equal to item dot, not date, but I want to get the date as a string. That's why I built up that function. By the way, if you are not that interested in using dates right now, that's totally fine. You don't have to include this at all. Now, before we call upon DB's functions, there's going to be one minor modification I want to make, and that is changing my isItemUrgent into a number. So again, I want isUrgent equal to false to be a 0, and if the item is urgent, so if urgent is equal to true, I want to change that to a 1, and this is just a slightly better way of storing the values within the database. So I'm going to create another val, item urgency, and I'm going to again change this to that classic if statement, which tests to see if isItem is urgent. So if isItem urgent, we're going to store it to be a 1, else we'll store it to be a 0. Okay, and this is again because of my database table. I've set that the item urgency is going to be an integer and not a Boolean. Okay, so back to it. Now, in order to put items into our SQLite database, or to put any data, we're going to do so through what's called content values. Okay, and this is because if we call upon our db.insert or add, I believe it's insert. Okay, look at the parameters that this guy is going to take in. I guess you can't really see them here. Okay, so we'll want a column hack, we'll want the table, and then we'll want values. So null column hack we won't worry about, we'll just pass in null to that. The table is just going to be the name of the table we want to pass in because again, some applications will have multiple tables. In our case, we just have the one, so that's easy to fill in. And values is going to take in a variable of type content values. Now content values is just going to be again a nice way to bundle all of this data into one place so that it can be easily fed into our table. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll create a val, let's call this content values. Okay, again, could be of type content values. Okay, we'll just set this equal to a new instance of content values. And we're actually just going to apply some stuff right away. We might as well use our Kotlin apply statement. And we'll feed in some values here. So we'll actually just use our put function, and this takes in a key and then a value of various different types. So note that we actually can't enter a whole to-do item. We have to enter primitive values, or strings, I guess, are not actually primitive, but they are kind of treated as if they are sometimes. Now we can kind of think about the key as being the column name we're trying to store these under. So we have a column name for the item name, we have a column name for the item date, and one for the urgency, and then we're just going to put in these corresponding values of the name, date, and urgency into those columns. What we should try and do is preserve the order. I don't think it really matters too much because we're saving them under the specific key anyway, but it's a little bit cleaner, it just makes for cleaner code. Note how we have our name, urgency, then the date in that order. So we have name is item urgent. I'm actually just going to paste that up here, and then the date again in that order. So we're going to put from here our database info dot, and then we have the table data or table info, and then we're going to put in our column item name first. So that's going to be again the key in which we'll kind of access these, or the column we're saving it under, and then the value itself, so item name. Okay, good stuff. So we'll do the same for the other two values, except obviously this is going to be the column that is the item urgency, and then date. So column item date, okay? And note that there is actually no auto checking to make sure that these are of the correct type. So you do have to be a little careful. We'll put in our item urgency here and then the item date. And then we're ready to actually call upon the insert function. So again, this insert function is going to take a few parameters. The first is going to be the table name. So we'll do database info dot table info. And then the actual table name itself, we want to specify which table we're inserting these values into. We'll set null for the column hack, and then we'll put in our content values, and that's actually all we need to do. This will actually return a row ID, which we could store in a val row ID, set it equal to this, but we don't have to do this because we actually don't end up using this variable. If you wanted to maybe like print out the row ID, that's cool, but we don't really have to do that. So that's actually our add item function complete. That's all we need to do. We are just specifying which values we want to store and under which keys or which columns we want to store them. And then we're just inserting them by calling upon the db.insert functions. This is what I mean when I said the SQLite database functionality is actually really nice and easy for us to use. The only real SQL statements we need are going to be our create and delete table queries. Otherwise, we can call upon these functions and it inserts all of that, or rather does all of that for us in the background. So now our add function is complete. I want to talk about our fetch function. I'll walk through this implementation with you. Then I'll let you try the modify or update. I'll pause, I'll show you the answer, and then I'll do the same with delete. So this function is actually probably not going to need to take in many parameters because we're going to be fetching all of the items at once. Likely this is a fairly small application and the fetch time is not really going to take very long because we won't have a ton of items in our to-do list. So we're just going to get all of the items at once, and we're not going to worry about whether it will return a ton of data or not. Realistically, you'd want to be careful about how much data you're returning because especially if you're using like web applications where you are actually having to download data off the internet, then you can end up with a pretty hefty bill if you're downloading more than you need to. Okay, so in this function, we are just getting our items. And if we want to be specific, let's say get all items. And by the way, if you weren't already aware, this database actually uses no bandwidth or no data or anything like that. This just stores all of the data in the device itself, so it doesn't need an internet connection to use. It's not using any of that, so don't panic and think that you're going to eat up all your data. Okay. So this function is going to need to take in one parameter, however, that's going to be again our database operations instance because we're going to need to get again a readable database this time. So let's just copy and paste that in. Again, this is going to be a readable database because we just want to read values from it. Now, this is not going to return nothing. Remember I said at the end of yesterday that we'll be dealing with cursors a little bit. Well, this is actually going to return a cursor, which is a way to iterate through a bunch of data. So the way that cursor stores data is kind of a little like a table. So it provides a nice way to access values by row and by column, just like as if we were reading from a table. So it's a really powerful tool. Now, because before I go filling in all of the values, I want to show you which function we'll be calling on to retrieve everything. We'll be calling on our db.query, okay? And actually, I guess there's a few options to choose from, and it's kind of hard to see all of the parameters. So let's bring this up. One of the first parameters we'll need is going to be the table name we're retrieving everything from. After this, we'll need the projection and the selection. So the projection is essentially which of the columns that we're interested in. In our case, this is going to be all 3 of the columns plus the ID, so 4 columns. The selection is going to be any kind of selection criteria. So let's say we only wanted items that were urgent. Okay, then we could specify in selection and selection arguments that will only return items if they are urgent. Okay, and we'll ignore all of the others that aren't urgent. So that's what selection and selection arguments are for. Then we'll have sort order, fairly straightforward, whether we want ascending or descending, so on and so forth. And then we're going to return this all in the cursor. There'll be a couple of other variables which will be null. One is going to be group by, which we'll set to be null, and the other is going to be having. Again, we'll set that to null, so we don't need to fill in all of these values. Okay, and as you can see, this is actually going to be one of the ones we'll use. We'll not worry about the limit either, but we'll use this third implementation of this method. So with that in mind, try to fill out some of these values. I'm going to walk through them myself. You know what? I'll walk through them with you first, and then in the update, then you can go ahead and try and fill them in yourselves. So the first thing we'll need is going to be, well, we don't need the table name. We can just fetch that as a variable. After this, we'll need the projection. So I'll create a val called projection. And this is going to be an array of, so array of, or, you know, I'll set that equal to an array of. And then we're just going to pass in all of the column names that we need. Now there are 3 columns, 4 if you include the ID, so we're just going to go ahead and get all of those. To save a little bit of time, I'm just going to copy this guy. Okay, and I'm just going to paste it. Let's say we'll paste it 4 times. Oops, kind of making a couple typos there. Okay, so let's just put this on a new line. So we'll want first the ID. So if we call underscore ID, or I guess this is actually going to be base columns. So base columns dot ID. Okay, there we go. And then we want the item name. We want the item urgency. And again, order is important because it's going to return things in the order we specify. And then we want the column date. Okay, so if we mess up the order, then we'll get, you know, we might get weird results and unexpected results. So again, this is just specifying which columns we want the data from. In our case, all of them. So if you really wanted, you could actually omit the ID. We're probably not going to use it, so you could take that out if you wanted. Okay, so next up is going to be the selection. So val selection. And this is going to be again used to specify which of the rows we want. Now we're actually going to leave this as an empty string because we don't want to kind of discriminate between any of the items. We actually want to fetch all of the items rather than items that have some kind of criteria. So I'll just walk you through a quick scenario in which, let's say we did only want the items that were urgent. So let's have selection args. Okay. And this would just be another array of, and then we'd fill in some strings. So let's consider that we, again, only want the urgent items. Well, in that case, what we'd probably do is say something along the lines of table info dot item urgency, and then let's say we want it, and then plus in the quotes here, we'll want like, and then a question mark. And then in here, we would say that we just want it to be equal to 1. So what this is saying is that we're going to fetch only the rows in which our column item urgency is like this, and we'll replace this question mark with this guy here. So in this case, it's kind of like saying like 1, which is going to return only the urgent items. If you had multiple arguments, okay, then you would say and some other column is like, and then you'd put in some other things. So let's say we only wanted them with a certain name, then you'd put the name and then the urgency, and so on and so forth. So hopefully you get the idea there. Again, in our case, we're just going to leave our selection blank, so just an empty string, and we're going to set selection arguments equal to null, because we don't want to we don't want to discriminate between the rows. We want to return all of them. Okay. So after this, we'll have the sort order, val sort order, and we're just going to set this equal to null as well. I don't care in which order they're returned. Okay, and then we're going to use our db.query. So now we can feed in all of the values we created. The first value we want to feed in is going to be our table name. So if we call upon table info dot table name, this is the table we're going to fetch from. After this, we'll want the projection, so we'll want all of the information from these columns. We'll want all of the rows that fit this selection, and this selection argument criteria, so selection args as well. We want group by equal to null. We don't really care about specific grouping. We'll set the having equal to null as well. And then we'll set the sort order equal to our sort order variable. Okay, this is now going to return a cursor. So let's create a val cursor equal to the results of this query, and then we'll just return that. So return cursor. Okay, so take a moment to kind of process this, and then once you're done, I want you to try the modify or update function. So just to quickly get you started, it might be something like this: update item. We'll probably again want the DBO of type database operations. Okay, we'll definitely need that. We'll probably want the item that we're trying to update. So maybe take in an old item of type to-do item. And then we'll probably want a new item, again of type to-do item. So it's going to be updating some old item with some new item. Okay, we're going to again call upon the DBO dot get writable database, or just writable database. We'll store this in something like val db is equal to this. And then the function we'll want to call is db.update. Okay, note that it takes in a table name, it takes in some content values, and it takes a where clause. Okay, so also and a where argument. So think about the table is fairly obvious. The values is going to be the values that we're putting in. The where arguments and the where clause. Where arguments is kind of like selection arguments in the get all items that we just implemented, and the where clause is kind of like the selection itself. So you remember when I talked about that having the like this, or the actual column name like this, and then passing in the actual values that we're trying to match? Try to do the same thing, but for the field in our update or db.update item. And it will essentially look something a little like this. We'll have an array of content values. This is going to be the new values that we're putting in. Then we're going to just replace the old values with what we're finding from our selection and selection arguments. And we're not going to be returning a cursor or anything. So it'll be kind of a mix of these two functions. So go ahead and take a few minutes to try it out yourself. And as per usual, I'll provide the solution in a few seconds. So just go ahead and pause this video. Okay, and this is something that I came up with here. So we're just keeping things super simple. We're assuming that each item's name is unique. And if we're finding multiple instances of the same name, we're just replacing them all, because I'm only kind of searching by the column item name itself. I could have added those additional clauses like the and then search for column urgency and column date as well. But again, this is just a really simple version of this app here. So again, we're getting the new items values and putting them into our content values, just like we did when we were adding an item. Okay, and then we're specifying the selection. It's going to look for a specific item already in the database that has a column name like this value. So let's say we have an item that's by groceries that's already existing in the database, and we want to specify that we want to buy apples rather than just groceries as a whole. Well, it's going to look for the item in the database that has the name like by groceries, okay, and that is going to be that name here. And then we're just going to replace it with this new item or these new values. So what this does is it replaces that entire row with this new information. We'll call upon db.update. And this is going to return a variable, so we could store this in something like count. It's just going to return us how many items were updated. So this might update one item, multiple items, depends on how many items match this particular search criteria. Alright, so if you didn't get something that's exactly like this, again, don't worry, this is it's pretty tricky stuff if you've never done this before. It took me a couple tries to get, at least, the first time I did this. Okay, so just take a couple minutes to look over it, compare your answers, make sure we're all good. And then I want you to try the same thing with our delete operation. So again, I'm just going to get you started here. We'll create the function delete item. We'll again take in a DBO of type database operations. Okay, and we'll take in the item name. or rather just the whole to-do item. So item, let's actually specify to-do item of type to-do item. Okay. So again, we're going to get a writable database this time. So val db is equal to dbo.get writable database, or just writable database. There we go. Okay. And then we're going to call upon a db.delete function. So this is going to be a little similar to our update in that we're taking a table name, we're taking in the where, and then the where arguments. So let's actually just select this and take a closer look at them. But it's going to be even a little simpler because we're actually just deleting something rather than updating it. So we don't have to insert new values. We just have to do kind of like we did previously where we have a selection and then the selection arguments. Okay, so go ahead and give that a go. Again, just feel free to pause this now. I'm just going to take a few seconds and then I'll show you my solution. Okay, and this is a solution I came up with. So again, all we're doing is searching for the item by its name. We're going to kind of assume that each item has a unique name, and I'm not too worried about deleting multiple items with the same name. So I mean, if we complete the task once, then why is it on the list again? And so yeah, again, like before, we're just searching for it by its name. We're saying, okay, where find every instance where the column name is like this value that we're passing in, and then we're just deleting it from that database. Again, this is going to return the number of rows that were deleted or the IDs. So we'll just call upon val, let's call this deleted rows equal to db.delete. And once again, that's all we need to do. So at this point, our database functions are complete. So I do apologize for the really long section. I was not planning on it going this long. But this is most of the hard work when it comes to the database complete. Calling upon the functions is actually pretty easy. The only really tricky part, and it's not really that tricky, is actually getting the information from the cursor in the right order. I'll walk you through that process in the next section, and we'll take a look at how and where to execute the other functions as well. So what I would recommend you do is, again, just give this a look over. Try to kind of picture exactly what's going on in each scenario. Maybe if you're still confused about any one function or multiple functions, then try a couple of examples in your head. So take the data that we have in main activity, we have a few items here, and then try to play around with if you were to try to delete, update, add, or get these items, and what kind of flow we would go through through these functions. Okay, otherwise feel free to take a break, and when you come on back, we'll show you again how and where to execute these functions to carry out these database operations.